live from Sister Basebone Studio. Urban Teachers Lounge is a platform for bridging the gap between educational scholarship and classroom teachers. Voices will include teachers, administrators, educational scholars, community members, and activists.
Hey everybody, welcome to Urban Teachers Lounge. I'm your host, G. Funmilayo DeVoe. This podcast is unapologetically for Black teachers, unapologetically by Black teachers. The purpose of the program is to bridge the gap between educational scholarship and classroom teachers. Today, I will be talking to you about the Black education research and agenda. So let me read it correctly. The book is titled Black Education, a Transformative Research and Action Agenda for the New Century. This is edited volume by Dr. Joyce E. King from Georgia State University. So grab your cup of coffee and let's talk. And I hope you have your coffee. So as you know, I'm often excited about my research, what I'm learning, the scholars that I'm learning about. Last time we talked, I talked about Dr. Siddle Walker from Emory University. And she actually, I sent her a podcast. Actually, I sent her the copy of the podcast from last week. Oh, she sent me an email back. I was like, oh my God, I'm dying, right? So anyway, that was just a little sidebar. I'm beyond excited that a scholar of her stature would entertain an email by me. So that was exciting. We'll talk about that later. But I wanted to talk about a couple of things that I've heard a couple of times within the last year. And that is, one, we know the state of Black education is on fire. Let's start there. But I've heard the questions keep coming up. Do we have a plan? What are we going to do? How are we going to come together? And so I wanted to start with a couple of quotes. One, I sent a message to my mentor, Dr. Sonya, Douglas Horsford. She's out of Columbia University in New York, Teachers College. She's a professor of education leadership. And I will definitely tell you more about her at a later time, but I'm saying her name because she is my mentor right now in some papers that I'm working on. And I sent her a blog that I saw, and her response was classic. She said, they have a plan, we don't. I was like, oh, they have a plan, we don't. Okay. So that led me back to thinking about Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker last week. Something she said, which she said, this is the first generation without a plan, a collective strategy. Okay. So I'm hearing this same theme where scholars are talking about a plan. Do we have one? So last year, I went to the AERA conference in New York. That is the Association of Educational Research. I said it wrong. I drew a blank on that. Here we go. American Education Research Association. That's what it is. So I went to the conference last year. And I had the privilege, this is the first time that I actually saw Dr. Joyce E. King. And I'm very glad I was not the one to ask this question, but in the middle of her, she was giving a presentation. In the middle of the session, one of a young scholar, probably a graduate student, asked her a question. So glad I didn't ask this question. She asked the question, and she said, so is there, what can we do to fix the situation, the crisis of Black education? And in true auntie form, if I tell you she showed out as an auntie at that moment, I was very glad I didn't ask the question. but her response was classic. She said, we gave you an agenda and a roadmap. And I'm glad that, one, I didn't ask the question, and two, she actually gave more information on where this agenda was. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. It's called the book, the novel. It is a Bible. I think we all need to not only read it, we need to breathe it, we need to think about it, we need to critique it, we need to analyze it in our spaces and places of influence, spheres of places where we reside in education. But the book, again, and I'll give you this information as I always do, I'll leave you some things to look at, to consider. The book, Black Education, a Transformative Research and Action Agenda for the New Century. So the question then lies, why, because this was last year, which is 2018, why did that young student not know about this book? Furthermore, why didn't I know about the book? I was just glad that I wasn't embarrassed publicly, and I'm sure I'm saying that jokingly, but I am saying I'm also bringing to front that we have scholars who have diligently worked for years, and we don't know their scholarship. And because I just happened to be at the right place at the right time to learn about this, if I wasn't there, I wouldn't know either. So I'm a firm believer as a teacher, when I find out stuff, I'm going to tell it. So this is what I'm doing. So I want to start with, and before I go further, I want to go back to an article that Dr. Walker wrote, and I'm going to add that to the end of this podcast too. The name of the article, the heart of it, is Organized Resistance. And so this gives the history of how Black teachers or Black educators, their role in organized advocacy. So I think this is the theme that I'm trying to get to. One, where's the plan? What's the action? How are we organized? Are we organized? Do we know the plan? And furthermore, how can we enact this plan? Somebody took the time to write it. Let's look at it. Let's see. Is it something that we can do? So I want to start with the quote, and I'm going to give just a brief overview of the book. Like I said, it is definitely a Bible. So read it, reread it again. The very beginning of the book, there's a quote by Dr. Ayi Kwei Armah, A-R-M-A-H. And the quote is this: in a people's rise from oppression to grace, a turning point comes when thinkers determined to stop the downward slide get together to study the causes of common problems, think out solutions, and organize ways to apply them. And he is a writer, a scholar in his own right. And I'll leave some information about him, but I definitely wanted to let's look at that. It says, in a people's rise from oppression to grace, a turning point comes when thinkers determine to stop the downward slide, get together to study the causes of common problems, think of solutions, and organize. We're back to that word again, organize. But let's think deeper. It says thinkers. So as teachers, one of the things that I argue all the time, particularly in where I work right now, I think I am constantly spinning. I'm spinning with tests. I'm spinning with the need to give more tests. I'm frustrated with my students and their test fatigue. Not frustrated that they're fatigued. I'm tongue-tied right now. I'm frustrated that we have to keep giving them these tests that is not producing the results that we want. So there comes a point where we as educators have to really sit back and think, what is the problem? And so I thought about something that we do on the K-12 level, the KWL, right? What do we know? What do we want to know? And what do we need? Or what have we learned? What do we know? What do we want to know? And what have we learned? And I'm changing that a little bit to say, what do we know? What do we want to know and need to know? And then what do we need to learn, right? So in order to fix a problem, you first have to acknowledge that, one, there is a problem, right? And then after you acknowledge the fact that there's a problem, deal with it. Reflect on what is the problem? How do we get to this point? What are some of the solutions? Some of the solutions come in looking back. That's that Sankofa principle, that West African principle of the bird with his head turned around, going back and fetch it. Go back. We have elders that have written. Yes, our scholars have been muted and marginalized, meaning they have written things and it hasn't made it out to the bigger audience. Yes, we have teachers that are not supported. Yes, we have these things, and this is a part of our problem. But the question is, how do we get organized? How do we come together? So when I worked on this KWL chart, the first thing I said, what do we know? We know that this is not working. We know that over-testing our children is not working. We know that disinvestment in public education, which is where most Black and brown children are educated, the disinvestment in that is not working, right? Because every year we're taking more and more away from public schools. Things that are, I argue this point, we don't have field trips because we have to have money for field trips. That means we can't take kids on field trips. You're taking out arts. I'm a musician, so I have an issue when music and art and theater and all of these things are challenged in our schools, because it also deals with a culture. Black people are a creative people, right? And we learn differently. Our ways of knowing is different. And you're trying to put a round peg in a square box, right? It's not possible. It's not going to fit, right? So every time we try to teach kids counter to the way that they learn, there's a problem. And so you'll see Joyce E talks about heritage knowledge. We talk about culturally relevant curriculum, meaning you actually considered the humanity of Africans and Africans in America, Africans globally. You've considered our success. You've considered how we've maneuvered in spite of oppression, right? So this is what we know. We know that there's a miseducation of educators. There's a miseducation of our students. There's a miseducation of community parents. That when I think about the number of parents that naturally assume, they go along with the hype that there's not going with the hype that teachers in urban schools do not care for the students, are not teaching the students. Like, there are some things that are not considered, right? And we really need to take a deeper look. We need to be a little more critical, not critical in, oh, you're not doing this and this. No, we need to critique some things. That means we're thinking, going back to the quote that I said, we have to first think about what is happening here. Why are our children still behind, so-called? Or are we behind? Or are you not teaching in a way that's culturally relevant and you're not engaging our kids? So I said all that to say, then, what do we want to know? We need to deal with a planning, a strategy, a collective strategy. Dr. Walker talked about how the elders, the Black educators in the South, pre, during, and post Brown, were organized. They came up with strategies and networks, and they had a collective agency. Do we have that right now? And that's something to really examine. We kind of get caught up in our places and spaces, but do we have that? So in the book, the book is divided into 8 parts. And there are a couple of parts that I just wanted to mention right off. Of the 8 parts, there are 4 parts that I want to talk about before I get to the agenda itself. So part 1 talks about theorizing transformative Black education, research, and practice. So what is interesting in my time in that education, that's since 2001, we've talked about research-based technology, research-based pedagogy. It's all this research-based, and my question has always been, who did the research? And did they research this situation in a situation that reflects the schools where I work, right? And so this is where the scholars that are in this book are challenging how we're looking at educational research. What was the consideration, right? And then how are we practicing? Because we have scholars that have done research, and the research is in the academy. We don't know it, frontline teachers, right? Teacher education programs, are they teaching these things? I don't know. Then part 2 is taking culture into account, learning theory and Black education. Again, we have to consider the culture of the people. How do we know? What are our ways of knowing? What are our ways of knowing? We know that we don't learn like other people. That doesn't mean that we're not brilliant. That means that we have to, if we're going to talk about differentiation of instruction, then let's differentiate. If you know that a student's way of learning is different from your dominant discourse and your dominant way of teaching and the dominant research, then we need to do something differently, right? Part 5 is situating equity policy and pedagogy in the political economic context. That is a subject all on its own. We have to understand, and my trip to New York really helped me to think deeper about educational policy. Who's writing this policy? Who's benefiting from the policy? Who's not benefiting from the policy, or who's marginalized by the policy, right? And then the economics, the money that goes in. This goes back to the disinvestment of public education. If you continually take money out of public education, then public education will not work. Is that your goal? So, that's a question for us to really think about. Part 6, I love this title. In part 6, it talks about humanizing education, diverse voices. And in that particular part, she actually had a conversation. There's a conversation between Dr. King and I think they're talking to another great scholar, Grace Lee Boggs. And that will be a whole nother conversation. I'll talk about her probably. I think I'm going to do a podcast about her next month for Women's Month, right? But we have to have different voices at the table too. I've challenged in my studies, too often when we say educational research, we're only looking through the lens of education. But we have to understand that education is impacted by policy, is impacted by social context, which includes racism, which includes gender, which includes class. Even within Black education, we have to acknowledge class structures, black middle class, black poor, and everything in between, right? And that makes a difference on how we maybe teach or how we approach our education. So these folks, we all need to be at the table. But it says, again, going back to this quote, study the causes of common problems. So you're telling me 60 years after Brown versus Board, black kids still can't read, black kids still can't do math? Okay, come on now. We need to take a deeper look on why that is, because we did build the pyramids, right? We did build and continue to build parts of this country, i.e. all of it, right? So in thinking about that, then we get right to the nitty-gritty of what Dr. Joyce King says for an agenda. This is a proposed agenda. I do want to say that the order of this book, it was written by a group of people, the Commission on Research in Black Education, and there were some elders at this table, let me tell you. Woo! So names that we are familiar with, know that they were present: Asa Hilliard, Lisa Dilpit, Linda C. Tillman, Michelle Foster, Carol D. Lee, Gloria Lansing-Billings. Of course, they gave honor to my favorite, Dr. Sizemore, who has definitely been carrying me through my research. And just the number of people that have laid the foundation, and then we're building on it, right? So know that this was even written from a cultural perspective, knowing that in Black culture, we honor our elders. We honor those who have gone before us. We acknowledge that we stand on the backs of some strong folks, right? And so you can't go forward without honoring the past, right? And then we critique it. You know, we should have our thinking caps on, like my grandmother used to say, right? Put your thinking cap on. We need to have our thinking caps on to analyze and come up with new solutions, right? So you have I want to just look at the agenda. So the agenda is actually written in the appendix. I think I found a copy of it, so I'll send it to you. The Transformative Research and Action Agenda of Human Freedom in the New Century. And so the very beginning, it says, the agenda focuses on the transformative power of using culture as an asset in the design of learning environments that are applicable to students' lives and that lead students towards more analytical and critical learning. So the agenda calls for some very big, tall orders. Number one, well-funded, large and small research to support and disseminate proven practices that use culturally relevant schema to organize and enhance instruction. So let's challenge the research that is done, right? Which is what I want to be a part of. I want to be at the table of doing culturally relevant research for education. Number two, authentic assessment instruments and methods that are informed by broader conceptions of what government mandated high stakes tests should assess, right? So we need to be honest about the testing. This is something that we know, but how do we do it? Number three, critical assessments of government mandated reforms and research-based community dialogues among scholars, practitioners, policymakers, parents, and other stakeholders, focusing on these issues, right? So who's at the table? When the government comes up with reforms, it sounds good. Oh, we're going to make American education great again, right? Okay. But are we doing that? And who's at the table when you're making it great? You can't make it great with only the voice of businessmen or policymakers. Where are the educators? Where are the parents? Where's the community? Where's this dialogue that needs to flow back and forth, right? We need to adequately fund and better educational opportunities for incarcerated youth. That's interesting that that is in there, because we're seeing, and we talk about this school to prison pipeline. We have to acknowledge that we have children that are going to jail for various reasons. Are they coming out? When they come out, are they prepared? Have they been educated? What were they educated about, right? Or are they going to go back into jail once they get out? Number 5, community building action research that brings researchers, parents, and teachers together. Again, we have to collaborate. We have to organize. We have to collaborate. We have to have diversity at the table, right? Number 6, policies and practices that ensure that qualified teachers and administrators are adequately prepared and equitable assigned and assigned to urban schools, right? So we have to have practices in place to make sure that we have folks that are highly qualified. Now, here's the deal. Are we highly qualified? Yes. But what are we highly qualified to do? Are we highly qualified and miseducated? Are we highly qualified and continuing a status quo cycle of showing I can't even get the words out, right? What are we educated in doing? And what are we teaching our kids, right? And then number, 7, public policy development informed by international comparative research. So it's not just Africans in America that are struggling academically, that are having the problems of education, right? Globally, we have this problem. And so are we sitting at the table with global minds and global thinkers to see what is working, what is not working, find the common themes? And that's increasing our network, right? The agency of network. Number 8, productive exchanges with Native American, Asian, Chicano, and Chicana educators and opportunities for dialogue and collaboration. 9, support for using cyber technology and the internet in the best interest of Black education globally. And of course, number 10, research, policies and practices that promote gender equity in education at all levels for Black males and females. So what I see here in reading this out loud, what I see here is this agenda has called for collaboration, has called for research, has called for thinking, has called for us coming together and not being single-minded in who's sitting at this table. There are many stakeholders in elevating Black children through Black education, through community, through networks, the national community, the local community, and the global community. So these are the things that we need to know. So, I think that in my first read of that agenda, I really was stumped because I thought, do we have the power to do that? Meaning, and I'm thinking of economic power, like, do we have the wealth building? Do we have everything that we need in order to make this a reality? And what I will say is our elders had a vision. They had a dream, and we're disconnected from it. We don't all know what happened in the process of that dream. We know we have a lot of cliches out here on what education, educational reform and urban schools, and we're going to turn it around. And you can't turn around something that has taken decades to manifest itself the way that it is. It's not going to turn around in 2 days or 2 years or 3 years. That's not realistic. But what we do have a plan. Is this a plan that we should move forward with? I want to hear your thoughts about this. What do you think? I'm going to talk about this again. I'm definitely going to have some visitors on to discuss, get their opinion, their input. I love my social studies teachers because they look through a lens so much different from mine, but sometimes, a lot of times the same. And I definitely want to have an open dialogue on this agenda. Can we do it? How can we do it? When can we start? How do we connect with each other? How do we reconnect with each other? How do we pick up the pieces, right? So we need to pick up the pieces. How do we reconnect and network? With that said, I'm always, as usual, I'm always glad that you're here. I'm glad that we had this time to just kind of review this book. I do want to hear from you. I hope you share the podcast with your community of teachers, your scholars, your activists, your friends. Follow me. Leave me comments. Let's discuss this. So, of course, you can follow me on Facebook. You can follow me on Instagram. You can follow me on Podomatic. And you can follow me on YouTube. And that is where I will leave. I always leave my notes for the podcast on Podomatic and on Instagram. On YouTube, because you have the ability to leave comments and suggestions. Well, until we meet again, thank you for your time, peace, power, and progress.